Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the February 17th, 2026 Sarasota University Colloquium. This evening, we have Justin Tosco, who I'm delighted to say not only is an extremely talented Montessori educator, he's also recently joined us on faculty at Sarasota University. Justin is an experienced educator, consultant, and advocate dedicated to building equitable, relationship-centered learning communities. Justin Tosco brings more than a decade of experience across public and private Montessori settings to learning communities. He's a third-generation Montessorian and has served as a teacher, administrator, and program leader, grounding his work in both tradition and innovation. Justin is a founding board member of the Montessori Association of North Carolina and has been recognized as both an Emerging Leaders Fellow and an Innovation Think Tank Fellow with the American Montessori Society. Justin holds a Master's of Education in Montessori and Montessori credentials at the elementary and adolescent levels. He's passionate about expanding access to high-quality Montessori education, particularly in the public sector. We're proud to have Justin here presenting this evening and helping us understand the role of storytelling in building community and belonging. Again, thank you, Justin, for joining us and for your contributions this evening to our body of knowledge. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lindsay. It really is a pleasure to be here. It's always hard when you hear your own bio at the start of a presentation because then all the pressure is there. But on top of that, my own mother is here in the session tonight. So I get double the pressure, which is exciting. Hopefully I'll live up to it. While I am beginning to share my slideshow, I hope everybody that's just hopping in will take a look at the question in the chat. Hopefully we can come back to this if we have time towards the end, but I'd love for you to be able to put in a movie, a book, a show, an article, some piece of storytelling that changed the way you see the world. And you can be thinking about it throughout the presentation, or if something pops into your mind, that's great too. But I'd love to maybe come back to these. I already see a wonderful example. So I'll go ahead and start sharing. And make sure everybody can see my first slide here. How does that look? How about a thumbs up?
That looks great, Justin.
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, excellent. So hopefully you're in the right spot. This is using storytelling to support community and belonging. My name is Justin Tosco. Super excited to be here. Thank you to Lindsay and Dr. Levins I see is here. Thank you to Heather White, who helped facilitate this, and the folks at Sarasota University for putting on these colloquiums. If you are not familiar with them and you're new to these, or maybe you're watching the recording of this and it's your first time seeing one of these, I cannot recommend highly enough to go to the Sarasota University YouTube page and check out a number of the other free colloquiums that have been on there. Some people who I'm very honored to say are friends of mine in the Montessori world and luminaries in this space. I have done sessions, other people that I just admire from afar or have read their books. There's a number of really incredible colloquiums there. They're a free resource for folks. It's something that I've already started to share in my circle and within the school community that I work. They did not pay me to say that. I just genuinely wanted to refer you all back to that. So I'm so excited to be a part of this colloquium. And we are going to talk about storytelling. I am going to try to leave some time towards the end so that we can have some discussion, hopefully, and maybe some questions if they arise. Feel free to be putting things into the chat. Lindsay's agreed to help me sort of monitor that along the way. And we'll get started. I think it's important, and honestly, this is a lesson that will come up in the presentation tonight. When it comes to starting with storytelling, I think it's often important to start with your own story. And so I'm going to do that tonight, the short version. So my story is that I am, as Lindsay said, a third generation Montessorian. This is me, the wee little baby here in the early 80s. Dates me, but you could tell by the grain in the picture. My mom, who's here in the session tonight, that's her holding me. And then her mom, my grandmother, who's also a lifelong Montessorian trainer of teachers, founder of schools. So this is a really special picture. It's up in my office right here, framed to my left. Um, but obviously, Montessori is something that's in my bones and in my blood, and in all my family. To be honest, my siblings all went through Montessori, and so it's something that's really been a part of my life from the very beginning. And speaking of the very beginning, this is me in the very beginning of my Montessori classroom. You could see that the Montessori materials have not changed. Thank God my fashion sense has changed. I have no idea what's going on with the tucked in shirt here. You notice a belt around the shirt, not even supporting the pants. Not sure exactly what's happening, and a little embarrassed to show these pictures, but how cool to see these materials that you would notice if you walked into any Montessori classroom today. So again, it's been a part of my story since the very beginning. Um, After I grew up a little bit, as a teenager, I fell in love with music and songwriting. And so storytelling really has been a part of who I am all throughout my life. This is a picture of me. That's me in the middle. If you can't recognize me, about, oh, geez, I don't know, many decades younger with blonde hair and many earrings. And then my siblings, this is our sibling pop rock band called Just In Case, where I was the songwriter. And so I was doing my own form of storytelling through my songs for many, many years. And we had a little bit of success, toured and recorded music, played all over the country and the world. And so that was sort of the first version of my storytelling. And then I decided I wanted to go to college, go to school. And so I went off to study filmmaking and video production, and thought I was going to maybe be a documentary filmmaker, and really learned about the art of storytelling through video and audio. This actually is a picture of me at an AMS, the event conference a couple years ago, where we were doing an audio video storytelling project with Montessorians. So the person sitting down there is telling her story of belonging in Montessori spaces. And that's a project I can tell you more about later. But another example of how using my video and production experience from school has carried on as a storyteller throughout my life. And then, as I was telling Dr. Levins and Lindsay before we started recording, very quickly in my early 20s, I got bit with the bug of working with children and adolescents. First through the YMCA and nonprofits, and then quickly after that, I started substitute teaching in a Montessori school with no intention of teaching or becoming an educator or being a Montessorian for that matter. But I picked up the Montessori Model United Nations handbook over lunch one day on a break as a part-time substitute teacher, and completely had that light bulb moment, that you sort of see in movies, where I realized, that you've seen those Venn diagrams of like where your interests and talents and the world's needs collide, and in the middle is your vocation. And so I truly discovered in reading that handbook what I was determined to make my vocation. And so this is a picture of me on the far left there. That's me with a lot more hair on my face in the United Nations in New York with my first group of students. We would take them to the conference, the annual conference every year, the Montessori Model United Nations Conference, after a year long of leading students through that work. And so this was my first orientation to the world of Montessori as a tool for peace education. And I've been totally hooked ever since. So now teaching is where I share my stories and where storytelling lies. So now I'm a school administrator. I work as the director of student and faculty culture and engagement at a Montessori school here in Durham, North Carolina. But I'm also a writer now. I publish a Substack where I write about stories and peace education and restorative practices. But I really have started to see that my work is living at that intersection of both Montessori from my early roots, and now the things I've learned about restorative practices and inclusive practices in schools. And to me, it is the best way to build communities of care. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And so, as far as today's story, what is the story we're going to tell today? First, I hope to share that stories are an essential and distinguishing part of Montessori. This is something I think anybody with a Montessori experience who has stepped into a Montessori classroom, we know this already, but it's always good to have refreshers and reminders, and I hope to do that for all of us today. I want to talk about how stories are not just an important part of Montessori, but really essential, powerful tools for positive change. Also, that storytelling is not just a tool for change, but for justice and for creating restorative communities. And then finally, ways that I think are really easy, bite-sized ways to begin starting storytelling as a tool for change and positive movement in your own school communities. So, starting with that Montessori piece, I love this quote. She wrote, "By offering the child the story of the universe, we give him something 1,000 times more infinite and mysterious to reconstruct with his imagination, a drama no fable can reveal." And that's from To Educate Human Potential. So, obviously, she knew sort of innately the power of storytelling, the power of sharing the story of the universe, the story of God with no hands, that origin story of the universe through natural laws, and that by introducing children to this story from a very early age, that we inspire lifelong journey of exploring, of learning, and really starting to find their own place within that story of the universe. Something incredibly profound that I feel I still carry from having received that as a young student. And so she really did, Dr. Montessori, understand storytelling as an essential way to inspire the learning process. And so we know it's what we begin with in our lessons, right? Um, and so let's talk a little bit more about some ways that storytelling is really ingrained, that it's not an add-on in Montessori, the way you might have in maybe more traditional settings where it's story time, but that it really is foundational. It's how we begin every important lesson. It's at the heart of our philosophy and our practice. So many of the lessons that we begin with, especially as students start to get older, begins with stories. And we know that from those great lessons, that it is not only that initial impressionistic spark that's meant to ignite curiosity and connection to other parts of their learning, but that it is the gateway that opens up the rest of the curriculum. How incredible to have those great lessons as stories that open the door for students to experience and learn all the important things they will in their Montessori classroom. And I just love this idea. And there's now, of like so many things in Montessori, modern research is catching up to these things that she was innovative about 100 plus years ago. But this idea that by sharing story before content, we're giving meaning before understanding. And that's, so counter to the model that we have in so many other education settings. And so story is profoundly important, specifically in Montessori settings. I don't have this anywhere in the slideshow, but I'll reference a few things that are resources I would recommend connected to storytelling. And the first one I might recommend that I didn't plan to say, but feels relevant right now, is Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why. If you're not familiar with it, it's a great read. It's for anybody, Montessorians or otherwise, where he talks about the power of starting with understanding your own why and how that influences and changes individuals, but also institutions and communities. And how amazing that, he wrote this, I don't know, 5 years ago or something. And Dr. Montessori was writing this 105 years ago, that we have to start with meaning. We have to start with our why, and that can then begin to lead to understanding of all kinds of things, of ourselves, of the universe, the communities that we live in. So, as I said, talking about Montessori Model UN and believing that Montessori is peace and justice education, I think for folks that will grant me that know that it is meant to be a pedagogy that changes the world, that is aimed at a fundamental restructuring to create a more peaceful and just society, then I hope to convince you that stories are the key to beginning that work. And so if stories are how we help students locate themselves in the world, I think it's important to ask this question: what stories help adults situate themselves in their community? So we know students are situating themselves in the story of the universe with those great lessons. And if we sort of like zoom into our classroom communities and our school communities and our education communities, what are the stories that help adults situate themselves within their communities? And then I think by answering this question, we can start to get towards communities where they are starting to understand stories of not just learning, like our students do in the classroom, but also belonging. So this is a little pop quiz. You can pop your answer into the chat if you'd like, or just think it yourself in your own mind. But I'd like to ask you to answer this question. When change happens, does it start with hearts, A, or B, with minds? So does real change start with hearts or with minds? And there's no quiz, there's no test. We won't announce your answers. But what do you think? And feel free to throw your answer in the chat as we go along. I'll try to come back and make sure that I give you what my answer is. But I think this is a fun way to start to think about, okay, well, if stories help us change the world, are stories meant to change hearts, or are they meant to change minds? Um, okay, I'm going to hold off on answering that. We'll try to come back to it. But I know one person who has an answer for it, one of my favorite people in the entire world, Mr. Rogers, who said this. I thought this was actually his quote. I found that it's attributed to Mr. Rogers, but comes from Mary Lou Konecki, who said that there isn't anyone you couldn't love once you've heard this story. Now, I sort of believe fundamentally in my own heart, morally, that this is true. And I've sort of lived this as in my experience, this is the case. But this is Mr. Rogers, I think, answering that question, that he believes that change happened in his stories on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood through learning people's stories as a way to connect with their heart and to enact change. And so he knew the importance of not just hearing, but really listening. I mean, that's the beauty of Mr. Rogers. You can go back now and watch him listen to people in a way that I don't think we do much of anymore. But really listening to people, and particularly children's stories. That's a presentation for another time, but how children are a marginalized community in our society, and we have to do more listening of children. I digress. But Mr. Rogers really was the master at really listening, not just hearing, but listening to children's stories. And couldn't our world right now in 2026 use more of this right now? He's a man who spoke from, worked from, and utilized his own heart to enact and create positive change. So I think that's how he would probably answer it. Let's fast forward in time and look at another, I think, positive change maker, Yuval Harari. You may know his books. His most famous one, I think, is probably *Sapiens*. He also wrote *Homo Deus* and a number of other things. He is a historian who writes a lot about how did humans become the most powerful species on the planet. And according to Harari and much of the science that he cites, although we are physically and have been physically the weakest and most vulnerable species, humans ended up becoming the most dominant species on Earth largely through their storytelling. That it was their ability to cooperate and tell stories that were shared stories that folks understood and communicated from generation to generation and agreed on that allowed us to become the most dominant species. He emphasizes that humans can cooperate in these massively large numbers, which is why we succeeded, because they believed in what he calls shared fictions. So those are concepts like money and gods and laws, these things that have no real tangible value or even things we can actually cite, but are shared fictions that we agree on as a society and as humans that allow us to then cooperate and and essentially become the top of the food chain, right? The picture I put in here is my second reference of a resource for the night. If you don't know this one already, this is the young, I wouldn't call it even young adult. It's a sort of a children's version of Sapiens that he put into 2 volumes. I put this here because I read both of these with my boys as read alouds at night. This became our nighttime read. And I can't recommend it highly enough. It's really, he does a great job targeting it kind of the maybe 5 to 12, 13-year-old range. And so if you have children, if you work with children as a teacher, this is a fantastic resource. And he says in that book that storytelling is human superpower. And so I really do think that storytelling is one of our superpowers. So we talked a little bit about what's happening in our hearts. I want to talk about minds. So does change happen through minds? And what you're going to see here is just a few very select abstracts from peer-reviewed researches that highlight some of the neurology and things that we're learning about the power of storytelling. So storytelling in indigenous cultures, storytelling to promote cultures of positive change within community, this idea, this model of transportation, which is this amazing model where people are more likely to act when they're emotionally engaged in a concept. So research has shown that stories actually persuade people more effectively than data alone. One example of this is that people are more likely to get healthcare after hearing personal narratives of others, as opposed to just hearing a list of statistics. My favorite example of this comes from philosopher Paul Bloom, where he talks about how making stories personally relevant is incredibly powerful. And he says, if I told you that there was going to be a bombing in some far off country and that hundreds of people were going to die tomorrow, you might lose a little sleep or feel a bit anxious about that. But if I told you that tomorrow morning I was going to cut off the tip of your pinky finger, you'd stay awake all night, anxious, upset, fretting about what was going to happen, panicking throughout the night, right? And it's this idea that when we make things personally relevant to us, the power is significant. There's that quote that one death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. And so when we take stories and we make them personally relevant, the impact is significant. That's the transportation model. And then there's another incredible bit of research that comes out of neuroscientists called neurocoupling, which you may have heard of as teachers or educators. But it's this idea is that our brain actually physically syncs with the storyteller's experience. So neurologists, as they study brain functioning, they've learned that when a person hears a well-told story, their brain physically reacts in the same areas as the storyteller's brain did. Not when they're telling the story, but when they actually had the experience of the story. So from a very neurological perspective, one cannot tell in these brain scans the difference between these two brains after both have experienced the story. So stories are creating empathy on a chemical level within humans. So there is this chemical change that happens where empathy is enacted through stories. The last bit of piece I want to share about what happens in the brain with storytelling is one that I learned quite powerfully going through that AMS project I mentioned at the beginning, which is this idea of reciprocal vulnerability. And I first heard about it from Brene Brown. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her work around vulnerability. But reciprocal vulnerability is this idea that by being vulnerable first and committing to shared risk and emotional exposure, that we invite that and elicit that from the people that are within our realm and in our community. And I just cited Brene Brown, and I didn't mean to do this, but I love the fact that the very next thing I'm going to cite, so we talk about a female researcher who centers her work on vulnerability, which can feel, for lack of a better word, it can feel a bit in your feelings, right? It feels feelingy and a little, soft. And yet I want to talk about something that's a bit the opposite, which is This man here, his name's Mike Vrabel. If you don't know him, he is the new head coach of the New England Patriots. If you follow the NFL, you'll know that they just made it to the Super Bowl, way ahead of schedule. That's his sophomore quarterback, Drake May. Go Tar Heels. And they made it to the Super Bowl when nobody expected they were supposed to get there, way ahead of schedule, right? They lost probably the best quarterback of all time in Tom Brady, and probably the best coach of all time in Bill Belichick. And here they are just a few years later in the biggest game on the biggest stage. And when we think of football, we think of things like macho and aggro and toxic masculinity and violence. Um, but I want to share something I really love about what Mike Vrabel did, which is that at the very beginning of the season, the Super Bowl season, in those early team meetings, he had all his players and staff share what he called the 4 H's. And he had them talk about their history, their heroes, their heartbreaks, and their hopes. The 4 H's. And you can see some quotes here that I pulled from some ESPN Instagram posts. But I'd like for you to hear from the players and the coach himself. So I'm going to try to share this video with you. And while you're listening, just notice what they're saying. You could put into the chat some things that you find interesting or surprising. And let's hope that it works. Can you see a new page now?
Yes, we can see
Okay.
the ESPN.
Yes, excellent. All right, let's see if you can hear this
That we were
video.
going to do these 4-H's and kind of get up there and share our stories. Guys didn't really know how that was going to go, kind of what it would look like. But Coach Vrabes got up first and he really opened up. And I think once everybody saw that, we kind of saw how cool this could be and how good it could be for our team to get to know each other that way.
I was nervous. It was my first time speaking like that and speaking candidly about me and some things that are probably pretty personal. I grew up an only child in Akron, Ohio. Parents were educators, so I got everything I wanted, but I always appreciated what my dad taught me about the value of hard work and also the value of being a part of a team.
I think when we first heard that we were going to
Definitely a vulnerable time. It's hard to, especially as men, you know what I mean? We kind of play the game to where we don't want to show too much emotions when it comes down to it, but, you know, those things help out for us whenever we get onto the field, you know, playing harder for your brother because you know what he's been through and how he's overcame those situations.
You know, there's adversity or there's, you need to hold somebody accountable. I think it's always coming from a better place when there's a connection. The thing that I'll always take away is how powerful a team can be when it's built properly.
Definitely a vulnerable.
All right. All right, Lindsay, can you see my screen again?
Yes, we're back to your presentation.
Excellent. So I'm not sure if anybody was able to put anything into the chat, but obviously this is a bit different than talking about Brene Brown. But what I love about this is a lot of things, and maybe I'll come back to some of them. But I love when he says when there's adversity or you need to hold someone accountable, it always comes from a better place when there's a connection.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about how powerful a team can be when it's built properly. And what he's talking about there is building a team on relationships. When he says connection, and when they talk about vulnerability, he's talking about relationships. And again, maybe this is a presentation for another time, but in my restorative practices training, we know that 80% of restorative practices is relationship building, that it's about that initial proactive, before conflict arises, building of relationship, connection, and trust. That's 80% of the work. And then 20% is responding to harm and conflict. And what I love is this, these giant football players talking about being vulnerable, talking about risk, talking about connection, talking about relationship. So I just love that as an example as a sports fan, but just also as somebody who's interested in restorative practices and storytelling. So to answer the quiz, I think that the answer is that change comes from hearts and minds, that it's not an either or, it's not a binary. But stories simultaneously are able to change our hearts and our minds. And not only that, but stories can change entire cultures. And stories can build cultures. And so if you go back to the earliest stories, we know that we get one of the most impactful elements of our society and our culture, religion, through stories. Some would say, if you're a Montessorian, that spirituality is a fundamental need. And it is that fundamental need that is rooted in stories that's been capable over millennia of both building conflict, but also great harm and violence, and or rather in peace. So religion is founded on origin stories, right? It is going back to Yuval Harari. It is these shared stories that have led to essentially all the world religions. The Abrahamic religions rely on those covenantal stories. Hinduism relies on those epic foundational stories. Buddhism on Siddhartha's enlightenment story. These are all essential stories in the building of religion. Likewise, indigenous traditions and oral traditions from all over the world across time have relied on stories for the preservation of their own culture, but also for the resistance against oppression all over the world and even now today. Stories are an essential part of that. I love this picture because of the circle, which is another essential element of restorative practices, if you're familiar. But there is power, great power in circles. I put Uncle Tom's Cabin up here as an example of an actual story, right? This was a novel that helped literally abolish slavery by exposing all these atrocities and violences to a massive audience, a much greater audience than would have otherwise heard it. And so, talk about a story enacting change. That certainly is an example, and I'm sure there's others. I love this. Oh, yeah.
Sorry about that. I
Yeah.
know you're busy.
Yeah. So, I gotta finish this. Okay, thank you. Sorry, everybody. So this is a great example. This is a guy named Marshall Gans, and you'll know the guy on the left, Cesar Chavez. Marshall Gans is now a Harvard professor, but he worked alongside Cesar Chavez for a long time in the farm workers movement. And he had sort of started to build something called house meetings alongside Cesar Chavez, where workers gathered in these homes and started to share hundreds of these individual stories with each other, stories of injustice, really, that then got rewoven back into this broader narrative for economic and social and racial justice. And so it started in these microcosms, again, these personal stories, and then got rewoven into the broader movement. So I love that story. He went on, Marshall Gans did, to work with Dr. King in the civil rights movement. A fascinating guy, worth a Google if you don't know him. Of course, you have Sesame Street and my favorite character, Cookie Monster. My kids call me a Cookie Monster because chocolate cookies are my weakness. But I put him up here because certainly Sesame Street uses storytelling to enact positive change through sharing stories with children. He's a great example because he's a character who transforms from this impulsive, chaotic character into one who is able to all of a sudden practice patience and learn how to eat healthier, what they call sometimes foods. He begins to be able to share with others. So he's helping children manage their own behaviors through the story of his own issues with impulse control, something I can relate to. Then you have something more modern and recent, like the Black Lives Matter movement online and otherwise. And then, of course, through Twitter, the hashtag #MeToo movement. Now, this is a powerful example of individual stories that form massive moral movements. So in the case of Me Too, these are survivors led largely by the voices of women, especially more public figures that get to share their individual personal experiences and their own stories of sexual abuse and harassment. And we know what kind of ripple effect that ends up having in our society. So we know, I think, from these examples, and there's obviously hundreds more, that stories fundamentally shape what a society becomes, and not only that, but what a society sees as both unacceptable in some cases and also possible. So they don't just reflect back to us our culture and the society in which we live, but they genuinely are able to reshape it. Some of you may have heard of The Danger of a Single Story, this famous TED Talk, and I bring it up here as an important sort of like caveat to this idea that stories can be powerful. Well, they can also lead to exclusion, and not all stories do lead to belonging. So this is Chimamanda Adichie. This is her famous TED Talk from many, many years ago. I was lucky enough to be shown this as a early career teacher when it first aired on TED Talks, where she tells an incredible story. Again, another resource worth a Google and finding if you haven't seen it. But she talks about how single stories, if there's a single narrative and one perspective, that it really flattens people and experiences and dulls what is our understanding of the world and the society around us. She talks about that it can create distance and fear and misunderstanding of the other, and that belonging really does require many, many stories so that we are not relying on one dominant narrative. So there is this need to embrace diversity in multiple narratives, and that multiple perspectives are able to, again, expand our empathy, expand our access to truth about the world in which we live. So I think this is just an important caveat and reminder that our understanding of belonging and actual belonging grows when complexity and diversity is welcomed and is able to flourish. So, where do we begin with all of this? Because we're not necessarily going to be on the TED Talk stage, and we're not necessarily going to write a best-selling novel. But in my estimation and experience, it doesn't require any of those things. We don't need a megaphone or a microphone or even a polished story. There are really simple, easy ways. If you buy into my idea, my pitch, that stories are an essential way to improve our lives and society, there's really simple beginning steps that we can take, and they can be woven into our daily practice. Many of you, I mean, and first of all, if you're a Montessorian and you teach or you're around students, you're probably already doing this in really powerful, critical ways. But regardless, well, in whatever circles you move in, there are ways to begin building trust and connection. And you don't have to see it as a story to see it as tied to this quote unquote storytelling, right? So anytime we're committing to connecting with our colleagues, with our friends, our peers, our loved ones, and trying to build that relationship that Mike Vrabel was doing with his team, we are beginning to lay the groundwork for sharing our stories. And so you could literally leave here today and give a hug, a hello, a quick chat, a friendly smile to the next person you see. And that is one step on this road. And then I would say maybe like the intermediate level is that you begin to embed some ways of storytelling into your daily life. This is an example of my favorite way to take sort of simple steps. It says rounders in meetings. Rounders is something my family has always done. Some people might call it like a round robin question. It's this idea that you throw out a single question for a small group, and everybody responds to the same question and gives the chance for everybody else to not only share their response, but also hear the responses of others. So often a simple way to connect quickly. These can start with really simple questions that are meant to be fun and lighthearted. They can be open-ended, things like share a story about a time when. They can always evolve into deeper, more vulnerable elements and opportunities for storytelling, but they can start really small for a really long time. I love to start my meetings as an administrator with a rounder, something really simple, just like we did at the beginning of this session today. For folks that are watching this in the recorded version, we asked at the beginning in the chat, what is a story or a show or a book that's changed the way you see the world? Something like that is a really simple way to invite stories. Another resource I want to throw out there, if you're not familiar, is the book, The Art of Gathering. Priya Parker wrote that book. She's also a great guest on podcasts. And she talks about a lot of important ways to gather in group And I love her concept of a generous authority, this idea that when you're gathering in community, that it helps the community when there is a host who's sort of actively guiding and shaping and protecting the experience. So it can still be fun and laid back, but it's nice to have a container for a way to begin sharing stories in a simple way like that. As we talked about with Coach Vrabel, that reciprocal vulnerability, modeling it first, be trying to be brave and step out as the first one, especially if you're in a position of leadership, or if you hold some clout. Maybe it's sort of a level meeting, or you're the director of a program, or you're the most experienced staff member. Those are the ones where, there's a real important impact if they're the first ones to sort of step out and model that vulnerability and starting with their own story, much like I tried to do today in our presentation. And then finally, we always want to make sure that we're practicing doing this in safe spaces. So just start with the places that feel comfortable. Maybe start with a spouse, or start with friends, or maybe with, oftentimes in my experience in schools, it's like a teaching partner is a great place to start. And then maybe you start to do some of these rounders or open-ended questions with the teaching team. Then maybe it's okay for admin to be involved. And then maybe you're doing it school-wide, But the idea here is just sort of starting small and starting in safe spaces where you feel comfortable. And it is a kind of muscle to build this storytelling and willingness to put yourself out there and be vulnerable. So it's just this idea that small stories, when we start to share them often, can begin to change the tone and the tenor of the communities in which we live. So this was another resource I just wanted to make sure to share. I love this little card deck. It's called Where Should We Begin at Work? I'll leave it up there for a second in case you'd like to make note of it. It is made by Esther Perel. She's a psychoanalyst and does a lot of psychology work, written lots of books, and focuses largely on relationships, but has extended her work out to workplace settings. And this is a great way to begin doing some of those rounders I talked about, a single question that everybody gets to answer, that gives a little bit more insight into folks at work. And there's a little key you can sort of see on here. The paper clip, those cards mean that it's meant for like a group work setting. The pencil, if you see a pencil in the cards, is meant for one-on-one individual conversations. And then there's another symbol, I think it's paper, and that's meant for any setting. But you can see like some examples here. One of the questions is the feedback I wish I had heard sooner in my career. And then everybody gets a chance to answer that. The last time I was really proud of our team, fill in the blank. I'll never forget my manager who. So that's just a few examples. There's probably 100+ cards in this deck. Love this as a resource for building culture and starting to build storytelling as a practice in workplace settings. So I wanted to recommend that. So in addition to being aware of that caveat I mentioned of the danger of a single story, I think it's important that we also have to be cognizant of, we can sometimes, when we sort of feel brave, maybe too brave about this, venture into areas of unethical storytelling. And so just being really careful and precise, just as all of us do as Montessorians, I think it's important to be sure that we're going about building storytelling culture from a place of great ethics. And I want to just share some easy ways to have this in mind as you're starting to do this. So as I said, starting small. So just shared prompts for storytelling that encourage participation without pressure. Another tactic I like to do with my teams is to send them the question in advance. On my best days and weeks, I'm sharing the agenda, the whole agenda, and it's fully prepared, and I'm, done all my homework in advance. But even when that doesn't always happen, I like to share the rounder question or the opening question in advance, even the silly ones and the simple ones. I think that's a really good practice. So start small, give heads up, share early and often. Always in storytelling, but even just in sort of in circle settings and in restorative practices, participation is always voluntary. And this is with students, should always be the case with students. Certainly when we're talking about personal stories and narratives, but we have to extend that to adults. And so naming that at the beginning of meetings or group settings is always essential. Inviting people to feel comfortable passing or saying, I'm not sure, or come back to me, is absolutely essential. And then reminding folks the importance of active listening. We say this to the students, I think, all the time. But I find students are often better at it than adults sometimes, because adults have their agenda and their to-do list and the next meeting they need to get to. So being really, really focused on active listening and naming what that is. So again, another presentation for another time. But if you don't have norms laid out at your outset of meetings and gatherings that you review every single time and then come back to at the end of meetings to say, how did we do? That's a strong recommend. And one of those norms should be something in the arena of listening actively. And then finally, empowering folks around the sharing of stories. So making sure that if you plan to share stories, that participants are enthusiastically and consistently willing to do so. This is more related to if you are capturing stories through narrative form, or you want to post something to social media or send it out in a newsletter, or somehow share more publicly folks' stories. But even if you're not doing that, I love this tagline that lessons can leave the room and stories stay. So when we're having conversation in any kind of work setting or relational setting, we want to remember that the lessons we learn can leave the room. I can take the lessons with me, but the stories stay there. And that's sort of a good guiding practice, regardless of how you're collecting these stories. Okay, I'm going to fly through some of these because I see the time. I just love these two examples as amazing ways that storytellers were ethical in how they told their stories. These are two documentaries, two of my favorite of all time. Highly recommend. The Territory is on Disney if you have it. It's also rentable. And this is a story about an indigenous tribe in Brazil fighting back against illegal logging and land grabbing farmers in their territory. The beauty of both of these, in the case of the Territory, the indigenous tribe actually are doing the filming, right? They've been given the cameras and they've been empowered to film this process and their fight for justice. Likewise, in the Alabama Solution, Oscar nominated this year for Best Documentary. This is on HBO Max, also worth a rental if you don't have HBO. Incredibly powerful documentary about incarcerated men in Alabama prison system that are using contraband cell phones to secretly record the going-ons and expose these awful, deadly conditions in prisons. And so they, again, are filming their own experience and embracing and being empowered to tell their own story. So just two incredible examples of ethical storytelling. I want to share this as an example. I won't give a ton of sort of leeway to or lead up to how this happened, but this is a project we've been doing in my school now, where we're capturing colleagues' stories about belonging through audio storytelling. Sometimes folks are just recording into their phone quietly, answering a few questions or telling a story about when they belonged or didn't belong in a school setting. And then sometimes I'm interviewing them, and then we work together. I make an edit, share a draft with them. They give feedback. I'm always making sure that they feel comfortable with the story. And then it's a way that we've been sharing stories more formally with each other in our school community. So I'm going to share this 3-minute example, and let's make sure we can hear it. This is from a teacher who, again, I have her enthusiastic and consistent permission to share this.
I didn't get it. I didn't read social cues very well. I ended up alienating people. I didn't know why I was being alienated. And so then that just made it that much more hurtful. Or realizing on some level, I did something. I said something or whatever that upset them, but I don't know what it was, and they didn't tell me. I went into 7th and the first half of 8th grade. I did not have friends, and it was brutal. It was brutal. And then when I got into high school and started doing theater, the first acting class, and then being in my first show, and my teacher was one of those life-changing, amazing people. And I was like, good at this. I love this. I love the people that are in this. And that really fostered my first sense of belonging. Being diagnosed with ADHD and then also being on the autism spectrum. And looking back at the role that theater played in my ability to interact socially. It's really shocking to people when I tell them that I'm autistic, because they're like, but you're so social and you're so engaged. And theater had so much to do with that. I had to understand how somebody else thought. I had to understand how somebody else would have responded in a particular situation by playing that character. And so it really helped me understand the way that other people think. And so it helped with that perspective taking. And then also theater had a lot to do with continuing that social justice work for me, because, I mean, the root of theater is collaboration, and the root of it is understanding people's stories. When you are playing a character, you're intentionally learning about other people's psychology and their stories and their backgrounds and their cultures. And then also, there is a way larger percentage of gay people than in other fields. Being surrounded by and friends with and learning from people from that particular community continued to sort of solidify this idea that I am a cisgender, heterosexual, educated white woman. I feel strongly that I have a critical responsibility to use those areas of privilege. Both my kids are neurodivergent. Having to advocate for my kids in the educational world, that became an incredibly strong part of my work, which again is another reason that Montessori is important, because again, if you're really looking at follow the child, then, I mean, there you go.
All right. Again, I could talk for a while about how these stories came together in this project, but I love that as an example of, again, somebody being empowered to tell their own story, the insights that she shared about how she learned about herself and the world, and then now that gets to be shared out with our little school community, and people now have a new sense for who she is and how she came to be in this work and what's important to her, and now feel inspired. It's sort of a snowball impact. This reciprocal vulnerability idea has really started to take hold, and so we have a number of these stories now, and again, some just doing it on their own and some in session with me, but it's become a nice little project. Okay, with that, I would like to close this out and just ask that you take a chance to respond to a closing reflection. We know that every community has stories already shaping it. So I want to ask you how you can begin to listen to to stories in your community. And so you can put this in the chat if you'd like. I'd love to see it. You can also write it down. You can also just take it away with you and think about it. But what is one small way that you could make space for story in your own community this month? And maybe a subtext to that would be, whose stories in your community are not being heard? And maybe that's one way to take an initial step. So as you respond to that in the chat, I just would like to close with this, that I believe that stories are not just something that we tell, that they really are these tools that shape how we can see one another, how we pursue justice, how we build restorative, trusting communities of care. And we know that in Montessori, we already have this power of story to spark understanding in children. So this work, I think tonight, is simply asking us to extend that same intentionality to all the adults that we interact with and those folks that make up our own communities. So I hope you will be able to leave not just believing that there's power in these stories, but that you can start to create some small, meaningful spaces for them to be shared wherever you are and wherever you go. Really, really super grateful again to Sarasota University and Lindsay and Heather and all the folks that made this happen. Jordan for sharing the trailer online. There is an opportunity to give feedback, I think, and I'll definitely put that slide up here in a second, Lindsay, but looks like maybe we have a couple minutes for questions or comments. Does that sound okay?
Absolutely. Yes, Justin, what a masterful presentation this has been tonight, and so many important points. I've taken lots of notes myself. Just so appreciative of the wealth of knowledge. Um,
Thank you.
Absolutely. And we had so many comments in the chat of appreciation. Crystal Perkins shared that they start their PLCs with the Tao of Montessori, the Catherine McTavish
Yes.
book, and a
Yes. It's a
question
great,
prompt. Yes. And tying in aspects of self-love. And she wants
love
to
that.
tie in asking about heroes
Love that.
from the 4-H's, I think.
I
Yeah,
love that. My a former boss also did that. Started meetings with the Tao of Montessori. That's a wonderful way to start and level set. That's fantastic.
absolutely. Um, Reminder to connect with my team through narratives and storytelling. That was from Ravi.
Oh, hi, Bhairavi. Yes, Bhairavi was in that AMS project with me. So
Ah,
the audio storytelling that you heard tonight, uh, just quickly, that was an idea that came out of a think tank fellowship, small group project from AMS that Bhairavi and a number of other amazing Montessori educators were a part of. And we modeled it after NPR's StoryCorps. And if you don't know
oh,
NPR's StoryCorps,
yes.
yes, it's incredible, super powerful 1 to 2 minute audio stories. Talk about powerful storytelling.
Hmm.
Um, and we used that model to try to bring stories of belonging in Montessori. And so that picture you saw of us filming at the AMS conference, that was a part of that project. By Ravi has a beautiful belonging story that she did, and uh, yeah, that was a inspiration for the audio that I shared with you tonight. So I'm so glad she joined us.
Yes, definitely. Nice to see you, Ravi. Glad you're here. Well, Justin, there was so much richness in your presentation this evening. We'd love to have you back again.
Thank you. This is wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And for those of you who may not know Sarasota University, we do offer bachelor's completion program, master's degrees, and a doctor of education in Montessori education and Montessori leadership. Holly, we will have the recording posted of this presentation on our Sarasota YouTube channel. So we'll make sure that this is available to you, and I'll be sending Justin the link as well. Um, and thank you, Justin, for posting this slide. If you'd like to receive a certificate of attendance for being a part of this presentation this evening, please be sure to scan the QR code, answer the 321 form, and we will make sure that you receive your certificate of attendance that you might be able to use at work for your continuing education hours. And we hope to see you at next month's Sarasota University Montessori Colloquium. Again, thank you, Justin. Our gratitude to you this evening for such a wonderful presentation, and to everyone here who took time out of your very busy day to join us. We appreciate you, and we hope to see you next month right here at Sarasota University Colloquium. Bye bye for now.